A wife, a mother, and a former gunslinger sets out on a quest to turn back the hands of fate and death. This is our review of Ain't No Grave #1 from Image Comics. See you in 3. Welcome back to Comical Opinions. This is our review of Ain't No Grave #1 from Image Comics. This issue is written by Scotty Young with art by Jorge Corona, colors by Jean-Francois Beaulieu, letters by Nate Picos, and the main cover, cover A, is also drawn by Jorge Corona. If you've heard of this title and have no idea what it's about, or you've never heard about this title at all, it's a classic Western tale, but there's definitely a supernatural twist to it, which is quite unexpected once you get into the story. Young's plot involves the main character, whose name is Ryder. She's a former outlaw who wanders the desert wilderness in search of a hard-to-find destination. Let's put it that way. In the course of her travels, as she's just riding along on her horse, seeing mountain vistas, desert wastelands, some forest, a little bit of everything. It's a very picturesque kind of comic. She first encounters a broken down wagon from a wagon train. She thinks it might be abandoned, could have supplies, you never know. She goes to check it out. And the first thing that happens is she finds a little girl and encounters a mother who comes out of nowhere with a shotgun pointed right at Ryder, who's willing to protect the little girl, presumably her daughter. And that moment, or that instance of seeing the mother and daughter and their state of peril, triggers a flashback. Ryder's taken back to a moment in the not too distant past where she remembers just living a happy life on the homestead with her husband and her daughter. And they're just enjoying life. She is retired from the bandit game, so to speak, and they're just enjoying their time together as a family. However, she starts coughing, and not just coughing, but coughing up blood. And when her husband, his name is Darius, calls in the doctor confirms their worst fears, that Ryder is gravely sick, she's dying, and she has, at best, a year left to live. But instead of lying down and just accepting what fate has in store for her, Ryder decides to put on her old bandito gear and sets out on a quest to do something that her husband is deathly afraid of, because he feels that it might be the cure that she's looking for might be worse than the disease. When the flashback ends, we come back to the moment where Ryder is confronting this mother and daughter. Ryder smoothly slips in and disarms the mother with their shotgun and pulls a gun on her as well, just to let her know that she is dangerous. But she also drops the gun, says, "Look, I'm not here to hurt anybody," and she rides off. A few days later, we catch up with Ryder as she's sleeping under the stars on her way to some destination that we don't quite know yet. We will. And she sees something happen, something mysterious, something ghostly coming at her through the woods. A herd of people come toward her, but the people are not alive. They're ghosts, they're spirits, and they're coming in as a sort of a swarm or a herd, and they're headed down towards the river. Ryder is caught up in the herd, and she's unable to resist, and they're pulling her along, dragging her along. And in the river, she sees a man who calls himself the Beacon, and he's calling spirits home to the river. He's saying, it's time to come home, it's time to move away, it's time to be where you are meant to be. And Ryder's being dragged along with him, and she's like, no, I'm not ready yet, I'm not ready yet. She gets dragged under, and then she begins to drown and suffocate, and then she blacks out. Then sometime later, she wakes up on the shore of the river, wet, coughing, unsure of whether or not she actually saw was true, but there's hints that maybe it was a dream, maybe not, we don't know, but the story continues. Days pass, and Ryder travels through the desert. She sees beautiful vistas, cliffs, some cases waterfalls, lots of sand, lots of desert. Even from a distance, Native Americans standing up on a cliff, mounted on horses, but they're watching her as she travels through this beautiful scenery. But eventually she reaches what looks like an oasis, and she dismounts her horse and says, "Sorry, horse, I gotta go here. I gotta go through this alone. You can't go any further." And she crosses through the oasis down into a valley, and it takes her quite a few hours worth of walking, and eventually she reaches her destination, which it looks like a little shack at the base of a cliff. And there's someone sitting outside the shack, like a guard or tollman, if you will. The person it's unclear what they look like because they're covered in blankets and animal skins and everything else. And they said, if you want to go further, you've got to pay the toll. Cyprus doesn't let anyone in it. And she pulls out 2 coins with the words Cyprus imprinted on it. And she pays the toll. And the cliff behind the guardsman separates and opens up and creates a path through which she can walk. And they walk together through, and they eventually come to this place that looks like a town that's nestled in the middle of a hidden valley. And then to end the issue, Ryder explains to the guardsman what she's here in Cyprus to do, and it's a doozy. I'm not going to spoil it because it's kind of too big to really spoil in a video, but even though we tend to do spoilers a lot, but it's a pretty big deal. So let's talk about the technicalities, starting with the character work. Scotty Young's mix of classic Old West atmosphere, very Clint Eastwood-esque type of lone gunman, the unnamed traveler, is absolutely 100% front and center, but there's a definite supernatural twist, and it's all embodied in this character of Ryder. And just from the little snippets of conversation and the little actions she takes, there's nothing really big from an action perspective that happens in this comic. It's all small conversations and small movements, but they communicate so much. And you can tell right off the bat that Ryder has a very, shall we say, colorful life behind her, and possibly one ahead of her as well. She carries tremendous weight. She's definitely committed to taking on what seems like an impossible challenge. And there's a lot of bravery in her that is willing to stand up to the consequences of whatever comes next. She's an incredibly engaging character, and somebody that you want to get behind almost immediately from a support and an empathy and a sympathy perspective. Let's move over to the art. That's drawn by Jorge Corona, and a lot of times we encounter artists whose particular style fit particular genres. They're not sort of universal or global. They don't work for everything. Jorge Corona, I think, falls into that bucket. We've seen Jorge Corona's work most recently with Transformers, which looks great. When he was doing Batgirls for DC, not great, depending on your point of view. But here, this is next level stuff. I mean, the artwork in this comic looks fantastic. Corona has an exaggerated anatomy style where certain parts of people's anatomies are stretched or maybe oversized or super thin, depending on what effect you're trying to achieve. And it gives it a sort of a whimsical quality that absolutely nails the atmosphere that Scotty Young is creating with this comic. So even though Jorge Corona for us kind of fits into that bucket of works for some things but not for others, this is a sweet spot for Corona, and it looks fantastic. Moving over to pacing and structure. So this is an oversized comic. It's 56 pages, so it's double-sized at the very least, and it moves like a breeze. There is so much here that you just soak in from the visuals, particularly with the sunset vistas in the middle of the desert and just this lone rider moving slowly across the horizon. This is a very visual comic. Much of the story is communicated through the visual experience of the setting and the landscape. And so even though it's 56 pages, it moves very quickly because there isn't a lot of dialogue there or narration or exposition. What's said is only what's needed, and the rest of it moves very quickly. So the pacing is fantastic. Regarding the structure, Young unfolds the magic of Ryder's journey pretty perfectly. I mean, you don't get I'm not gonna spoil the details about the cliffhanger because it's a doozy, but you can tell that Ryder is on a path to do things because her life and the love of her family are at stake. So the stakes immediately are very high. The plot is very simple, but it's everything on top of each other. It's the plot, which is simple but very clear and very hard hitting. It's the emotional stakes, which are very obvious and very hard hitting. And then you have the atmosphere of this hot, dusty old West, but there's a sort of an undercurrent of supernatural mysticism that gives it a sort of a whimsical veneer or quality to it. It all works beautifully. So from a structure perspective, even though the plot is simple, it's all the extras around it that make it special. Thematically, if we're talking about the themes, this is a quest. You have using the metaphor, it's the knight is on a quest to kill the dragon. Now there is no knight, it's Rider. There is no dragon, that's something else entirely. But the concept is there. So the even though the challenge seems impossible, uh, the cliffhanger really makes it the most incredible kind of curiosity inducing cliffhanger you can imagine. And so we can't wait to see how it turns out. But the theme there, yeah, pretty much is Knight goes on a quest to kill the monster, and whether or not that plays out that way or it turns into something completely different remains to be seen. But we're really looking forward to it. So, final thoughts. Ain't No Grave #1 it's just a mesmerizing tale about a former gunslinger who sets out on a quest to save herself and her family. There's a very healthy mix of those classic Western tropes of the lone gunman riding through the wilderness, but the way Scotty Young intermingles supernatural and fantasy elements to kind of give it a sort of a fairy tale quality to it is just fantastic. And then on top of that, you have Jorge Corona's art, which I think works better in some comic properties than others, but here it is amazing looking. So this is a beautifully written comic. It's a beautifully drawn comic. Therefore, we're going to give Ain't No Grave #1 from Image Comics a 9 out of 10. It's a high score because it deserves it. This is a thoroughly entertaining and thoroughly engaging comic. Would recommend you pick it up. Let us know what you think. Do you like westerns with fantasy bent to them? Do you like your westerns more traditional? Have you read this one? Have you not read this one? What do you think? Let us know in the comment section. Please like, share, comment, subscribe, and stay tuned through the outro for the next review.